Hello to everybody. I'm going to provide a very short introduction to session 3 today, in part because my lecture notes for one of the two topics of session 3, which is called Leading in Place, is uploaded on Canvas under our course. So you should be very familiar with the lecture notes, and this will just be an introduction to those lecture notes, and I'll say a little bit about assignments at the very end of it, and then I'll say more about your responsibilities when we get to the end of session 2. And one of your responsibilities is, if I forget to do that, you have to ask me about it in class. So that session 3 is August 24th through August 26th, and two really important topics are on that day. One is called Leading in Place, which I'll introduce today and define today. And the second is learning to lead. It's the idea of continuous improvement. And it's the most, those two things I think are just absolutely essential to how you think about leadership. They get to many of the false impressions that we have when we're just beginning our leadership journey about whether I'm a leader and whether I can do this or I can do that. But first thing we have to do is get over being worried about leading and just lead. So, let me talk about leading in place for just a minute. The most common definition of leadership, people think about a position of power. Maybe they want to be the chancellor of a university. I don't know. That sounds a little crazy these days. Maybe they want to be a chief executive officer of a company. Maybe they want to simply lead a health practice of some kind, maybe a dental office or a doctor's office or a section of a medical school. Could be hundreds of different things. Now that's a very important part of leadership, is to be responsible when you get into a position of authority. And I'll say more about that in class, and more is said in my lecture notes. But leading in place is not about having the power to do something. It's leading in a situational aspect. That is, when you have an opportunity to make a big difference, whether or not you have the authority to do it. I really think that leading in place, or leading when the opportunity arises, is the very hardest form of leadership. For one thing, you often have very little warning or forewarning about when the situation will come up. Secondly, you may not have any authority to lead in place. Somebody else may have the authority, and they may get very mad at you if you try to change the nature of the discussion, or if you try to lead the decision in a direction that is different than what the person with the most formal authority has. That doesn't make you wrong, it just makes it harder. Oftentimes the person in authority is not trying to do the right thing. It's sad for me to say that these days it seems to be the rule in the public sector rather than the exception, that people are leading for self-interest or hyper-individualism rather than asking themselves the question of what's best to do, what's the best way to think about this. Great leaders, I think, ask the question, what's in the best interest of my institution? In our case, what's in the best interest of East Carolina University? So, we also often individually, and there's self-interest is always important. I don't want to be critical of that, but we often pay attention to our own credentials, which we have to do. That is our vita, our resume, our educational achievements, and so on. That's a very important thing to do, especially when you're young. It just shouldn't be 100% of what you do. And you also have to pay attention to your career ladder. That is, what does it take to get from where I am now to where I want to be? You might change your mind about where you want to be, but you ought to be aware of the steps. It took me 5, 6, 7 steps to go from getting my PhD at Ohio State University to being the chancellor of a university. For a good bit of my career, I didn't know I wanted to be a chancellor. It wasn't until I ran into a guy named Terry McTaggart, but I'll tell that story later. So I don't want to have you misinterpret me. It is very important to focus on credentials in your career ladder, but opportunities will arise for you to make a huge difference. And that's what leading in place is about. So please review my lecture notes and see what you think of ways to lead in place, and we'll have more discussions of that in class. An example that I won't talk about much today, but I think the two perfect examples of leading in place occurred in U.S. women's gymnastics. Two former gymnasts who had no formal authority. That is, they weren't in a position to make a decision about the horrible sexual abuse that had occurred in U.S. women's gymnastics and at Michigan State University. So we have a reading on that. Look at your required readings and read the article on Raisman. She's one of two people, along with former gymnast Rachel Den Hollander, that I think just decided to do what was right and not what they had authority to do by calling attention to what Larry Nassar had been doing to women gymnasts. I think that if it wasn't because of both of these people and the different ways that they acted, that the scandal that is among the worst, perhaps the worst of any university sexual harassment scandal in our history, might well have been swept under the rug. There were certainly dozens of people who were committed to sweeping it under the rug. So I'd like you to read the article on Raisman in the required reading. I think you should get online and find some articles on Rachel Den Hollander, who is now a lawyer, who's recovered from her own harassment, married with, I think 3 kids, and both are great examples of leading in place. So that takes some real courage, and I'll talk about that in just a second. But again, I think leading in place is the most important thing you can do when you think about being a really effective leader. Okay, I'm back for a very short discussion of additional discussion of leading in place. I think one of the requirements of leading in place is that you have to accept criticism, because if you take a stand on something, if you take a stand for doing what's right, especially when the majority don't want to do everything that's right, or the person in authority might have a lot of authority, doesn't want to do what's right, you're going to get criticized. When I was considering a leadership position in higher education, my great mentor, Chuck Middleton, I asked him what it took to be a leader, and he said, the wisdom of Solomon, the patience of Job, and the stomach of a goat. And upon further discussion, I figured out that the stomach of a goat meant that you had to accept criticism. And for me, for a long time, that was a very hard thing to do. I didn't like it when people criticized me unjustly, or for that matter, I wasn't very good at just accepting criticism. There's a good side to a lot of criticism, and we'll talk about this in class, but the first requirement for leading in place is not being afraid of criticism. 95% of the time, if you lead in place, somebody's going to criticize you. It doesn't mean you were wrong. It doesn't mean you should have been silent, just the opposite. It means that it's a natural part of leading is getting criticism. Gradually, over many years and with a lot of gray hair, as you can tell, I got used to the idea of public criticism. Now, in public criticism, I think you have to be careful never to look for a fight. Enough fights will come your way just because you're in the public fishbowl and everybody or an awful lot of people will believe they have a right to tell you how to do your job. That's a little bit crazy compared to the private sector, but it's a fact of life. So you never want to look for a fight. My operating philosophy was always you wanted to not look for a fight and try to find compromises, except when fundamental values or except when the definition of who you are or what the institution stood for was at stake. And then you had to, in some cases, accept a fight rather than let somebody else misdefine or say the wrong things about your institution. Then you have to be willing to take a stand. So that's what courage is about, and that's what criticism is about. I'll end this part of this introduction to leading in place with some assignments for you. Your first assignment, I think, as I said, is to read the lecture notes. Well, first assignment is to look at this and then read the lecture notes. Then thirdly, I want you to think about an example in your life where you saw someone else lead in place or you led in place and why you were impressed by that, why that was so important, and why it was so difficult. So I ask you to come to class with your example in hand. I'll have at least 2 examples in addition to Raisman that I'll talk about. So we'll each have some examples about leading in place, and I think that will help us define what leading in place is. And then the last assignment is I'll have some study questions, and depending on how hard I think they are, we might break up into teams, but we'll decide that more toward the middle of August. So again, this is one of the very most important topics in the whole class, leading when you have a chance to make the biggest difference. You don't have oftentimes the choice of when you can lead in place. You have the choice of being silent and letting other people mess things up, or taking the criticism and trying to lead in place. Even if you fail, you have the choice of trying to make a difference. So I hope you take this very seriously. The best examples of leadership are cases like Raisman and Rachel Den Hollander, and then some examples that I'll talk about in class made a huge difference. So with that, I wish you well, and we'll see you soon.